So welcome everybody. I'm excited to see a lot of faces I recognize, and also a couple of new ones. Um, Thank you for coming. I want to start out just immediately by saying congratulations to Paige, because yesterday was her book's official launch day. So it is finally on shelves near you, right?
Yes, it is. I took my middle daughter, with me to the local Barnes and Noble so we could see it in the wild, make, make it feel real to me and to everyone. So,
That's incredible. It must be such a cool feeling. Also, such a relief to see it actually there on the shelf.
yeah, exactly.
Like it must almost be surreal
It is
after
very
having
much,
you,
very surreal.
behind the scenes for so long. But yeah, so why don't I ask you to introduce yourself to the group so that you can sort of focus on the parts of your story that really like feed into the discussion today.
Yeah. So I'm Paige. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. I've been there for my entire career since graduate school. And the lab that I run there is called the Developmental Behavior Genetics Lab. So, what we study is how do genetic differences between kids influence their development over time. And we're particularly interested in cognition and achievement, which was the subject of my first book, and then mental health problems that emerge in late childhood and adolescence, which is how I came to be interested in the topic that's core to this book, which is about how do our genes influence our risk for addiction, for antisocial behavior, um, for sexual behavior. Um, and there's lots that's interesting, I think, about thinking about how genes influence those things. But one thing that all of those phenotypes or all of those behaviors have in common is that we tend to also think of them not just from a psychology or psychiatry lens, but also from a moral lens. So people have opinions about whether or not it's good or bad to hurt someone or become addicted to alcohol or drugs or to have sex with many sexual partners. Um, and I'm I have a somewhat unique history in that, at least amongst academic scientists, and that I was raised as an evangelical Christian for the first, for my childhood, and considered myself evangelical until my early 20s. And so after my first 20 years in the church, and then my second 20 years of life studying how do our genes influence our behaviors that are moralized and punished. This book is very much my attempt to think through about how have the ideas from the first half of my life shaped how that science is received and used, and how do I think that they go together, this kind of puzzle that we are agents who hold each other responsible, and we also know that we're shaped by our genes. So that's how I got into this mess. That is how I ended up writing about this topic and thinking about this topic.
Interesting. My first question was going to kind of be a little bit about what was the inspiration for going in this direction, but I think, you've kind of given us that already. Um, I think, one thing that immediately just springs to mind, and what, I'm going to actually hold this question for you. I'm going to get into a question that I think is a little more broad and will be a little bit more welcoming to the topic at large. And it's a short question, which is basically, to what extent are your genes like destiny?
um, not destiny. It's very hard to put a question on how much destiny. I feel like destiny is an all or nothing thing. It's either destiny or it's not. Um, there are, in very rare cases, um, genetic variants that are, I would say, highly penetrant. So they have really strong effects that are pretty universal across time and place and culture. An
Mhm.
example I give in the book is a very rare variant in the MAOA gene. So the MAOA gene is on your X chromosome. If you're a man, you only have one X chromosome. And so if you've inherited a mutated copy from your mother, you have a 50-50 shot of having inherited that. That changes the function of an enzyme that's very important for how your neurons communicate with one another. And there aren't that many people who have this variant. So we're talking about a small group of people, but of those who do, it seems that they all struggle with impulsive aggression and antisocial behavior. The degree to which they're violent is different, but no one is functioning psychologically and behaviorally normally if you have that variant. So you might think of that as you're destined to have some problems, although the degree of those problems is going to vary. A little bit like Down syndrome. If you have a trisomy on your 21st chromosome, you're going to have Downs. The degree to which you're impaired is going to vary, but having 3X chromosomes is going to profoundly affect your functioning, regardless of your culture, regardless of whether you were born in 17th century France or today. Most of the time, I'm not studying that. So most of what I study is common genetic variation. And so those are, in many ways, that's like asking if your childhood environment is destiny. No, it's not. Like there's a lot of variation in how childhood environments affect you, but it does make a difference. If we're accepting major mutations in the human genome, most of the genetic differences between us are not destining us to behave in a particular way.
Interesting. Okay. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think all of us can kind of look at our parents, for instance, and say, like you can see ways in which you're similar, but your lives haven't played out in quite the same way.
Yeah.
Uh,
And you're also genetically different from your parents too. So, you're only 50% each of them. So your genes could have affected you in ways that also made you different from your mom and dad, which I think is different a little bit than often people think about genes as a source of intrafamilial difference rather than just continuity from parents to children.
does that difference come about from like a combination effect where like getting you know, there's like two genes that interact, and if you get the one from your mom and the one from your dad, like they won't react the same way with each other.
Yeah, exactly. Or just, I think a really simple example is to think about height. Like your mom might be of average height because she has a mix of height increasing genes and height decreasing genes. And your dad might be of average height because he has that same mix. But you might just have, by luck of the draw, happen to get all of your mom's height increasing genes and all of your dad's height increasing genes and very little of the height decreasing ones. And so you the genetic potential for height that was kind of scattered throughout their genome got concentrated in a special way for you. And that's why occasionally you end up with like one sibling that's 4 inches taller than everyone. And everyone's like, is he the mailman's? Like, where did that come from? And it's
Right.
because that was in the gene pool already, but was countervailed by other things in the parental genome.
Right. So this is like what we mean when we talk about something being polygenic, right? Like it
Yes.
comes from a number of different genes. And so, you kind of can't like it sort of relies on getting a set that all points in the same direction to really
Yeah,
get.
exactly. So the MAOA thing that I was talking about earlier, that's a single gene mutation. So that would be monogenic. But almost everything, when we're talking about variation in the population, not these kind of isolated rare effects, is polygenic, poly meaning many. And so you have lots of genetic variants that are influencing someone. So to give you another example relevant to height, this I talked about this in my first book. There's this NBA player, Sean Bradley, who is like 7.5 feet tall. I mean, he's extraordinarily tall. And he was on a plane and he just happened to, probably very uncomfortably, like shoehorned in there. And he just happened to sit next to a geneticist that was like, do you know why you're so tall? Do you have, some sort of gigantism mutation? And he said, no, I mean, my parents are tall, but they're not tall the way I am. And so they genotyped him. And it turns out that he was just in the, if you think about a normal distribution, a bell curve of height increasing genetic variance, he was 5 standard deviations above the mean. And so it wasn't like he had one gene that was just really weird and rare. He just had all of the ones that make other people like a millimeter taller than other people.
Okay. So this, I feel like I've heard of people referring to, like, especially when it comes to genetic stuff, like a reversion to the mean. Is this
Mm-hmm.
almost like when the opposite of that happens?
Yeah, exactly. So, you might have gotten um, a high number of genetic variants that predispose you towards X, and then you mate with someone who's not necessarily genetically similar to you, and then your kid is going to float back, back to the average. So it's going to be um, parents who are extremely tall are most likely to have a kid who's not as tall as they are. And parents who are extremely high IQ are likely to have a child who's
Like
slightly
not,
lower IQ than they are. Yeah.
but occasionally you'll get that rare combination where like
Yes.
all the like where you kind of get the extreme
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
other direction.
I think the number is something like there's 70 trillion possible genotypes that could occur from the mating of any two people. So if you think about that as a number of potential offspring. Now, obviously, with that many, so many of them would be very similar to one another. We're talking about small genetic differences, but there's a lot of people in the world, so there is space for strange things to happen when two people mate.
Yeah, for sure. That's I'm gonna hold on to that number for when we get
Yeah.
later because I want to talk a little bit down the line about like embryo selection.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've written a very interesting piece on that. Um, but to pull back on something that you've kind of mentioned already about kind of your environment growing up and your sort of genetic set that you inherit. Um, I'm curious about sort of how those two things interact with each other. A lot of these studies look at like are like adoption studies to try and sort of isolate that effect. But I'm curious what we know about how like you as a child having genes that you get from your parents kind of can either have like a reinforcing effect that kind of brings out that expression, or I'm curious if there's other cases where there's almost a mitigating effect where like the parents are like, we know we both struggle with this thing, and so we're going
Mm-hmm.
to help raise our child so that they don't struggle with this. And maybe you get kind of like a skips a generation type dynamic. Uh,
Yeah.
do we know about that kind of like almost co-evolution of the sort of
Yeah. We
environment
do.
kind
And
of
I
stuff?
think some of the best research on this is the adoption studies, because then you have this really interesting design where something about the inherited genetic liability um, by knowing something about the child's biological parents that never raised them. And then you can see how does the biological parents' behavior, which is presumably related to this genetic liability in the child, how does that predict how the adoptive parents treat the child? So we're both looking at parent effects on children, but also children effects on behavior, which
Mhm.
I don't know how many of the people on this who, if you, by raise of hand, who has children on this call, if you're willing to no one,
I
maybe.
have news, which is that I'm pregnant.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh, Taylor,
yes.
congratulations.
I'm very curious about these questions.
Yes. So, I mean, I have 3 children and they are very different from one another. And what you realize when you have kids is you have all of these, you have all these notions about what kind of parent you're going to be. And then your kid arrives and your kid is like, I have notions about what kind of parent you're going to be. And different children pull for different things. Um, and so what we see at the research is that children whose biological parents have some history of either addiction or violence, like perhaps they have been incarcerated for a violent crime or they've been seriously addicted to a substance, are more likely to be treated by their adoptive parents with harshness, harsh punitive discipline. You can also even see this in experimental studies where they bring a child in with conduct disorder. So conduct disorder is psychiatry's label for kids whose primary problem is that they lie and they cheat and they steal and they are aggressive. And they just assign a stranger, a volunteer, a woman in from the community to interact with them in the lab. This was child development research done in the 90s. And they saw that even strangers would begin to respond with more coldness and more harshness to children that
Ooh.
have this genetic liability. So there's something about a child that doesn't seem to be as pro-social, is more hyperactive, who is more rule breaking, that tends to pull on average for less warmth. Parents feel less cuddly towards their kid if they're torturing the family cat. And also um, more harsh discipline. The terrible irony of that is that those children respond least well to punishment and
Mm.
most well to warmth. So if you take children who have this genetic liability and you put them in kind of some sort of learning task where they're going to get digital money in return for doing a task correctly, you'll see that they learn from losing money, from punishment, or from, it a shaking of the screen and like an error tone. They learn from that less well than if they're rewarded for the behavior they should be doing in that learning task. So that there's both a correlation and a kind of terrible interaction there, which is that
Mm.
the genetic liability pulls for coldness and pulls for harshness. All children, regardless of genotype, have the best behavior in response to firmness, but not harshness and warmth. But it seems that antisocial children are like particularly vulnerable to that. Um, so when we think about, sometimes I'm asked, like, as a behavioral geneticist, how does that inform your parenting? And I think it's informed my parenting a lot in terms of thinking about what gene environment feedback loops, like what sorts of environments are my kids likely to pull for, and which of those do I want to encourage? Like, oh, you want to be in front of the screen? You can play your Python coding game all day. Like I'm fine with that feedback loop. But there's other ones that you have to deliberately work to kind of stop if you don't want that behavior to
Mm.
escalate.
So almost look for like what is the kid gonna want to do automatically,
Yes. And
and like
sometimes you're like, let's lean into that.
you're
And
like you're like
sometimes,
please keep reading. Like I would I'll like let
exactly.
you stay up past your bedtime if you want to
Yeah,
read another book.
exactly. Exactly. No, my kids just they just keep happening to find reading lights left in their bedroom and they think they're doing something very sneaky by staying up past their bedtime to read. And they've never gotten to the fact that like, why does this always have batteries? Like why is this light never going out?
That's really funny. Um, I'm curious, thinking about this question of parenting and these experiences in early life, like do do does the environment of early life like have an outsized impact? My assumption here is yes, but like how does that then, when we want to think about change and potentially, rehabilitation and things like this, like once the world has kind of pigeonholed you, typecast you, you see yourself as like inveterate, whatever it is, right? How can you kind of in later in life make changes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yes, I mean, in utero and the first 3 years of life are incredibly formative for what is a person's brain going to be like. And when we're thinking about early life, also, what is their attachment system going to be like? What do they expect in terms of caregivers? And then even earlier in utero, we this isn't peer reviewed yet, so this is preprint, so take this with a grain of salt, but we just finished a paper where we're looking at genes associated with risk taking and antisocial behavior and substance use across 4 million people and looking at when in development are these genes most active, and the time in development where these genes are expressed the most is in the second trimester of pregnancy. So in utero, in early brain development. Um, this also fits with what we see with the animal literature, where there's a lot of literature suggesting that in humans, children who were born early, so preterm birth, is a risk factor for ADHD and for later antisocial behavior. And you also see that in animal models of preterm birth. Guinea pigs seem to be very popular for measuring for modeling birth processes. So there seems to be something about that in utero brain development that seems to be particularly important. That being said, you're not fully cooked as a 3-year-old. Like there's many aspects of development that continue. And one of the reasons that I'm particularly interested in late adolescence and late childhood and adolescence is that is another period where your brain is undergoing rapid development, and you're also have rapid development in your identity. Like, who is your peer group? Who am I as a person? From where do I derive social status? And you see a big shift in, there are some kids who are persistently antisocial even in childhood before adolescence, and that those we can come back to that, but those children have the worst prognosis over time. But then you see a big uptick in kids who are antisocial. Terry Moffat called these the adolescent limited antisocial behavior, where they were functioning normally and very pro-socially in childhood, and then you see this big uptick in both addictive behavior and antisocial behavior in adolescence. So there's multiple windows of risk, but then there's also multiple windows of intervention too, if you're thinking about
Mm,
these new periods of plasticity that are happening in development.
interesting. And then, after adolescence,
So what you see, I mean, just in terms of I kind of want to
like,
separate the can
I guess
people change. Oh, DJ has a
I want
question.
to I want to just add one thing because I think a lot of times these discussions come up around like the criminal justice system and you even thinking beyond that towards like substance abuse rehabilitation centers and things like that. Like how much can at that point, like down the line in like properly into adulthood, can we make changes?
So I think it's difficult to discriminate what changes can be made and what changes do we already see with our current approaches. So the
Mhm.
second question is easier in a way than like what
Yeah.
can be done. Um, we definitely see that recidivism is higher and behavior is more stable once you're getting out of adolescence. So if you're just like statistically saying, is someone going to behave differently in a year from now than they're behaving now? There's a lot more plasticity. There's a lot more variability when we're talking about 3 to 5 or 15 to 17 than when we're talking about 25 to 27. It's interesting once you get into older adulthood, particularly for men, there seems to be also a very pronounced aging out of crime, which there's lots of competing theories as to why that is. So I do think that people are capable of change, and it's good for us as a society to have as a prior that change is possible. Um, but it is more difficult. People's life courses are more canalized once you're getting into early adulthood compared to adolescence or childhood. I think that your intellect has a salon maybe tomorrow or maybe it was last night with Jennifer Doliak, who's a friend of mine, who's just written a book called The Science of Second Chances. And it's exactly on this topic, which is, okay, once people are in the criminal legal system, what are the things that are most likely to project them taking a different course rather than continuing in the system? And I really like her approach because it's not this looking for a panacea. It's not looking for like one thing that's going to change it for. It's like at different points through the system, can we see empirically is the best way to sort of redirect behavior, which I
Mm,
think is probably the right approach.
yeah. DJ, do you want to hop in with your question quick?
Yeah, I just have a quick technical question. I don't
Yeah.
mean to hijack it. You mentioned with substance use in this study, and as someone who has substance use disorder, um, is you say most expresses in the second trimester. What do you mean by expresses? I mean, does that mean like if my mom had a drink when she was pregnant, that like increased my
No,
chance
it
to be?
no, it means so what we did is so the first step of this is to say, okay, what genetic variants are more common in people who have certain diagnoses or behaviors, right? So in this case, what genetic variants are more common in people who have a substance use disorder versus people who don't? And then there are reference databases that look at essentially RNA sequence data. So your genome, your DNA is sitting in your, sitting in the center of your cell, and it is being turned into proteins via RNA, which is, RNA. There's lots of, but it's kind of a messenger molecule. Let's say it that way. And so what we're looking at is in databases where we've taken, not we, the scientific we, the royal we, which means other people doing a lot of hard work that I'm capitalizing on. Um, Other people have compiled databases of different tissues at different points in human development, and what RNA do you see there? And that is in a measure of gene expression.
I see.
So,
Okay.
so we're saying these genes are associated with having a substance use disorder at age 35. And then you go into a database and you say, okay, when are these genes most expressed? And it's in when that, not necessarily that person, but when the person who we are forecasting will ultimately have a substance use disorder, it is in cells taken from, fetuses that are 15 to 35 weeks post conception.
But expression can be triggered by environment, right? I mean,
Yes, it could. So it could be that this is a genetic liability. And the reason why it's most expressed in utero is because that's when the brain is most sensitive to certain environmental insults.
okay.
Or it could be that it's expressed because that gene is relevant to a certain part of the developmental program that's going into building a nervous system. So why it's expressed, basically the the um the reasons why it's expressed at that particular juncture, and is that expression environmentally dependent, is a next level of analysis that we don't have data to speak to.
Sure. Makes sense.
Um, you know, speaking, as we're about, you know, these sort of opportunities for rehabilitation later in life. I'm curious, to hear a little bit more about sort of how society responds to this information of learning, say, about like the Bronner syndrome gene, and whether that like kind of from that like moral perspective, whether people are like more forgiving in those circumstances where they know that someone is genetically prone as opposed to just like somehow choosing to be antisocial or not.
So I would say that there isn't one intuition. What's really interesting is that people's intuitions about whether, first of all, whether even they believe it, like whether or not they buy the story that genetics influence antisocial behavior, um, is something that people vary on. And then if they do believe it, what effect does that have on their judgments can also differ between people. It can also differ within people depending on the scenario or kind of which story is being activated. There are examples. I talk in the first chapter of my book of this case in Tennessee of this guy, Bradley Waldrop, I believe is how you pronounce his last name. And he um, attempted to murder his wife, murdered his wife's best friend, did it in this kind of frenzy. And in the sentencing phase, it was clear that he did it. Like no one doubted that he, committed this act. But in the sentencing phase, his defense brought up the fact that he had a mutation in MAOA. Now, not the MAOA genotype that I'm talking about, this rare variant, but a common variant that now scientifically we think might not really have much of an effect on behavior, although they didn't know that at the time this case happened. And the jury and judge ended up, he didn't get a sentence. He wasn't convicted of first-degree murder. He was convicted of, I believe, second-degree murder. And when they asked the jurors, they said that the genetic evidence was very influential in their thinking. That, a bad gene is a bad gene. And if he didn't have this gene, he might have been less impulsive. And so maybe he wasn't guilty for this kind of premeditated act. This was in 2000, I want to say like 2007-ish. And there was this thinking at the time that maybe that this was going to open the floodgates to genetic evidence being entered into courtroom proceedings. And it didn't work out that way at all. So in the intervening years, there have been other attempts to introduce this kind of like my genes made me do it defense. And most of the time, it hasn't been successful. And there's occasions where it seems like it might have actually made people more punitive because it activated their sense that if it's genetic, it's truly who the person is. Maybe they're like bad to the bone or a bad seed, and also more likely to not change. So jurors or judges might think if it's genetic, what hope do we have for this person? We need to lock them up.
Right, to protect them from doing it again, kind of
Yes,
thing.
exactly. So there's people have called this the double-edged sword of genetic, and it seems to be whether or not you're thinking about, or it's related to whether or not you're thinking about genes from a more determinist lens. So there's a you, and then there's your genes that are somehow separate from you, and like your genes made you do something, or your genes are constraining your agency in the situation. But you can also see genes in a more essentialist way, which is your genes are who you really are. And it's telling you something about like who this person really is and their likelihood of behaving this way in the future. And so if you're seeing it in a determinist way, it tends to mitigate people's punitiveness. But if you're seeing it in an essentialist way, it tends to make people more likely to recommend punishment. There's also a great study by Susan Gelman, who's a psychologist, where they basically give people a set of scenarios and they say, imagine that you've conceived a child by a sperm donor, and after the fact, you learn these various things about the sperm donor. So the sperm donor speaks French. The sperm donor went to college. The sperm donor committed a violent crime. The sperm donor is very tall. How likely do you think it is that the child you conceived with the sperm donor will also speak French or be very tall or commit a violent crime? Right. And there are some people who are very confused and they're like, yes, my child would be more likely to speak French. And you're like, no, genes don't work that way. So people really differ in whether they think that a child conceived by a sperm donor that's committed a violent crime will be more likely to commit a violent crime themselves. And then they ask, in a different scenario, if someone committed a crime, how many years in prison would you recommend for that person? And the people who think that violence is more heritable actually recommend longer prison times for crimes than shorter ones, which I find really interesting because it's counter to how we use genetics in a lot of other ways. So most people who believe, for instance, that body weight is very genetic are less likely to say that, people should be blamed for being fat, or less likely to say that being fat is even a moral issue. It really counteracts this kind of moral stigma. But when it comes to violence, those kind of absolving attitudes around genetics really seem to go out the window.
It's interesting because I feel like, the opposite, obviously, of these kind of antisocial behaviors are the things that we would consider virtuous in society. And often people are praised and no one says, well, obviously, like they got a huge amount of that intelligence genetically. It's not, they don't get to claim it, for instance.
Yeah. They might even think of it, I mean, so who do you consider a more morally praiseworthy person? Someone who really struggles to do the right thing, or someone who's so pure of heart they couldn't even imagine doing it any other way, right? So this idea that you could have done otherwise doesn't necessarily make you more praiseworthy. And then the flip side is you couldn't have done otherwise, which is how some people think about genes, doesn't necessarily make you less blameworthy either.
Mm. It's interesting. I noticed through your, all the pieces that I've read, that you've written this kind of word choice coming up again and again. And I'm going to lead this into a little segue
Yeah.
into this embryo selection topic,
Hmm.
because I think that that's a place where it becomes just like increasingly relevant. So I included it in the pre-readings for the salon if anyone had a chance to take a look at those. But Paige recently wrote a wonderful essay kind of looking at this new kind of science of sort of pre-implantation embryo selection based on like polygenetic scores that is becoming available through various Silicon Valley labs, and just kind of this question of like I guess that I have so many questions about it.
You and
But the
everyone
one,
else.
but the one is this real moral question that you write about in your piece of like, if that option is available to have selected the 1 in 72 trillion,
Yeah. Which is
right?
not usually you have like 1 in 8,
Right. It's
if you're
it's 1 in 8,
thinking.
but still
Yeah.
those eight are,
Yeah.
a subset of so many different options. Um, but you like opting not to make that choice then is choosing to get whatever randomness gives you.
Yeah.
And so, like, if you do end up having a child that has a problem, society might say, well, you chose not to avoid this, in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Just the option. I'm really glad you're picking up on this. So I will say in a preface that I think the technology for this is changing really rapidly. And I think that any new technologies can surface differences between values that maybe existed in tension, but you didn't have to grapple with it until it kind of came to this. I'm mixing my metaphors wildly here, but like came to this point, right?
Mm.
And um, and I think there are different values that are in tension here. And I will say that I kind of don't trust anyone who has a very high confidence view as to like, this is the answer. Like, this is the moral answer around polygenic embryo selection. I think there's a lot of different sides to this. So, the idea here is that people like me have done a really large genome-wide association study. So, we've measured the genomes or taken advantage of biorepositories where people have measured the genomes. I'm not going around with like little tubes getting everyone's spit. um, and have searched for genetic variants that are more common in someone who has a certain phenotype. So taller versus shorter, has an alcohol use disorder versus doesn't have an alcohol use disorder, has gone further in school but versus hasn't gone further in school. And then you have a long list of essentially correlations between genetic differences between people and whatever phenotype you're measuring. And then a company can say, okay, I'm going to take those results and you're going to do IVF, either because you're doing IVF anyways, you are struggling with fertility issues, or maybe you're not, you just want to use our technology. And so you're doing elective IVF. And I'm going to take this information from these large scale studies and I'm going to give you my best prediction about which embryo is most likely to develop an autism spectrum disorder, or which embryo is most likely to get hypertension or diabetes. Like, this isn't just obviously in behavioral space, which is where I am, but also in the medical space. And there's real, I think, what I would consider kind of scientific issues that are unsolved here. Like, we don't know what most of these genes are doing. Some of the genes that are associated with negative outcomes might also be associated with what we might consider positive outcomes or things that we might want. These genetic risk predictions tend to work less well when you're going across ancestry groups. So when you're going from people who are less like white British people from the UK Biobank, the genetic predictions tend to work less well. But I also think it brings up real issues around parental autonomy, like who gets to say what information you use, or what technology you use in order to um, build a family. And then also parental responsibility. Like, does the parent's responsibility to protect their child from harm extend all the way down into minimizing their chances of having a certain genotype, even in utero? And then also, we are talking about an invasive medical procedure that does have rare but not insignificant side effects for some women. And what does it do to the already onerous labor of reproductive labor to make that the new norm, that you're also going through IVF on top of it? So, and then of course it gets drug into, as it does, America's already a deeply divided country when it comes to reproductive rights. So I think there's a lot of, I mean, we can dive into any one of those, but there's a lot of different ethical considerations pulling in different directions, I think.
Yeah. The one direction that interests me a lot is this question around traits, around sort of genetic scores that kind of point in like the good and the bad direction at the same time. And I think about this. I was actually specifically curious to ask this about this sort of like set of genes that kind of all point towards antisocial behaviors. And I was
Yeah.
thinking like, do those kind of like rule breaker genes also correlate highly with like creativity and things that we like to have in our societies?
I mean,
Uh,
I think they
like, is
do.
society made better by the fact that like we have some people like this?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, when my colleagues and I did our first big paper on genes associated with disinhibition and risk taking, it was common at the time to publish along with the paper kind of like frequently asked questions, sort of press release thing. And we had an internal debate about whether or not we should say something about whether or not these scores should be used for polygenic embryo selection. We ultimately decided against it. We just thought that's not within the purview of our paper. But we had this conversation, and one of my colleagues was like, well, of course, if you of course someone would want their child to be less genetically at risk for antisocial behavior. And our other colleague was like, you had a child with a fighter pilot. Like, your reproductive choices clearly belie your stated preferences when it comes to risk taking. Like, you would not. And I think that's a really relevant point. I mean, we discover genes associated with serious forms of antisocial behavior by looking at what you might think of as misdemeanors. Like, we don't have large numbers of people who are genotyped who've committed murder. But we know from lots of theory and evidence that serious antisocial behavior is correlated with low grade doing things that are punished and doing them anyways. And so one of the phenotypes that we include in our models is number of sexual partners. And so it's like, would we want to breed out the risk-taking genes? Well, clearly not, because those people are having a lot of sex with a lot of people who want to be having sex with them. Like, there is kind of a stated versus revealed preferences tension here. The other thing I will say, which is like a very, that was a personal anecdote, but is there are studies of people who are elevated in antisocial behavior, but not to a disabling degree. So again, none of these people are committing murder, but they might have gotten into a fight or like maybe shoplifted when they were teenagers. And there's a great study by a group of economists looking at who is most likely to be a successful entrepreneur by the age of 35. And it's white men from middle to upper income families who also engaged in non-trivial amounts of antisocial behavior in adolescence. And if you've known entrepreneurs, like that tracks on a certain level, right? Like there's a certain level of risk tolerance and a certain level of I don't want anyone telling me what to do, and a certain level of I'm much more motivated by reward and not really that moved by punishment, that can manifest in deeply antisocial ways, but also in ways that are really innovative and creative. In one of the chapters in my book, I talk about this passage from Durkheim, so early 20th century, one of sociology's founders, where he argued, and I think correctly, that a society without crime isn't possible, but if it were possible, it wouldn't be desirable, because the only way to have a society without crime is to have such homogeneity of morality, of minds, of bodies, that society could never evolve in any way if we had that level of homogeneity. And that really unlocked something for me, because most mutations are deleterious, but without mutations, you don't get evolution. You have to have some level of deviance within a system in order for it to evolve. And so I think of that. I use this thought experiment. I'm actually curious what y'all's answer to this to be, but if we had some puritanical eugenicist dictatorship, and they said, okay, starting today, every couple that wants to become a parent has to use IVF, and they have to have no history of addiction or substance use or antisocial behavior in their family. And then of their embryos, you have to pick the one that's least likely to be risk-taking. And repeated that so that we just, in every generation, had the most rule-bound, the most inhibited, the least impulsive, the least likely to be antisocial. Like, would we want that? So, like, would we want the most puritanical of us, that to be where we go as a society? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think thinking about that way, like, are those the cities you want to live in? Are those the friend groups that you've been in where they're populated only by the least antisocial people? I think there's something about us that resists that notion that that's where we want to go.
Right. Is that the fighter pilot you wanna have babies with?
I watched Top Gun on a plane when I went to LA 2 weeks ago, and it totally holds up. And like, these are very risk-taking people, and they're not presented as unattractive sexual partners in that movie.
No. And I think with that, since you've already turned the question around on the room, I think this is a good time to open the floor and hear from everybody.
Yes, I agree, Nate. I'm also against the dictator just because it violates.
DJ.
Yeah, this is terrific. I think, as far as your research goes, I think it's good that you're focusing on something besides IQ, right? I mean, I don't mean IQ. I mean, I believe in IQ, and I think it's very relevant. But it's such a reduction of reification of everything into a single number, and that's just and like being hyper focused on that. I think it's just. I mean, it introduces all kinds of problems into the discourse and blah blah blah. But I do wonder, like to Taylor's question about something being both good and bad, right? Like charisma is really good if you want to get things done, but it's also really good if you're a womanizer, right? I mean, like Bill Clinton, the same skills that made him a womanizer are also why he was very effective at politics. And I wonder, the problem is there's no blood test for charisma, right? There's no, or in my case, for depression, there's no blood test that says, yes, you are definitely depressed, and here's a medication that will fix that.
Mm.
And I'm just wondering, is there any research or progress on the equivalent of that? So it's not just kind of assessment surveys, but it's like, no, we've identified, we can tell that you're charismatic because you carry these three genes.
Yeah.
And yeah.
No. So I will say, so I first started working in genetics the summer after my freshman year of college, so the year 2000, and it was the summer. I mean, you can do the math. You can figure out how old I am, and that's the summer that they completed the first draft of the Human Genome Project. And at that time, there was this hope that maybe there would be like 10 genes associated that cause depression, and another 10 that caused schizophrenia, and another 10 that caused bipolar. And if that were true, and then we did the studies that we've done in the last 26 years, that we would have found them, and it would be a lot clearer to say, similar to the way that, like, if you have a cough and a fever and you go to your doctor and they're like, okay, well, we've ruled out flu and we've ruled out COVID, and it turns out that you have strep, there's a kind of a diagnostic test. If the genetic basis of mental illness had been how people imagined it in the year 2000s, which is a small number of discrete genes that are associated with each illness, it might have worked out that way, where there was a diagnostic test where you're like, you've got the bipolar genes. It didn't work out that way at all. And what happened is that all mental illnesses are associated with thousands upon thousands upon thousands of genetic variants that are scattered all throughout the genome. Many of them are in non-coding regions where we don't even know what they do. And they overlap incredibly heavily, so that the genes associated with schizophrenia are correlated at 0.7 with the genes associated with depression. So this sense that how we, by categorizing the co-occurrence of symptoms, have divided up human experience was going to be echoed at the level of the genome, such that we could easily parse, these are the genetics genes and these are the antisocial behavior genes, and we can give you a clear picture of what you have, did not work at all. And instead, we have more discoveries than we quite yet know how to make sense of. And most of them are not unique to any one mental disorder. Like, or they're not even necessarily unique to a disorder, right? So we know that people who have high levels of schizophrenia genes, some of them are associated with going to college for longer, or being an artist, or being in a creative profession. So humans are really good at dividing things up into, like, this is this bucket, which is a good bucket, and this bucket over here, behavior, is a bad bucket. And the genome is like, we don't care about your buckets. Like, the genome is much more mysterious than we could have anticipated, or did anticipate, 25 years ago.
That's really interesting. I might follow up with you down the line to ask more questions about that. Shine, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so I recognize that some things are trade-offs, like risk-taking, but is it meaningful to talk about pure criminality independent of risk-taking? Like, can you target that?
Yeah, I don't think so. Oh, I'm just hearing an echo. Did that work? Maybe I'm too close to
I
the
heard it for a
microphone.
second, and then it
Yeah,
seems like
it was
it's
very strange. No, because I don't think criminality is ever a pure thing. Like, criminality is a layer of social and legal judgment that's layered on top of behavior. And there isn't some things are criminal in one place in time that aren't criminal in another place in time. And it doesn't really correspond very cleanly with what you might, from a psychological perspective, measure as dimensions of personality. So One example is you might think, I was thinking about like to put a fine point on it, like something like Purdue Pharma. So let's think about like executives at a pharmaceutical company that knowingly lie about the addictive potential of their drug, and they get millions of people, they contribute to an opioid addiction, and none of them ever see jail time. Right? Is that pure criminality? And then you have someone who's addicted to opiate use drugs who has a high genetic loading and was born addicted to drugs, and that is obviously criminalized, and they do see. So I don't think the level of I don't think the level of how we would rate things in terms of a personality scale, like how callous are you to potential harm, and then how that harm is manifested, or how that personality trait is manifested given your particular position in society, and then like what the criminal consequences are there. I think those just can pull apart in really obvious ways. I'm going to revise your question a little bit, because there are people who are antisocial without being impulsive. And I think that there are people that engage in premeditated aggression against other people. And it's not because they couldn't stop themselves, it's because they want to. And that's what we might call not disinhibition, but antagonism. And we're actually working on that right now to see if we can distinguish the genetics of antagonism from the genetics of disinhibition, but I don't have results on that yet.
Okay, thank you.
Nate, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. So trying to distill this down into a short question, I'm thinking of something like the Texas bell tower shooter, right? Like if you're familiar with the story, where
Yes.
like normal guy like ends up with a huge tumor in his brain, goes crazy, starts shooting people. Like this is an example of a person who has like an abnormality that is affecting their behavior in like very bad ways.
Mm-hmm.
So you could imagine that like instead of putting this person in jail, you just give them neurosurgery and remove the tumor, and like they go back to normal, or at least not violent. Um so as gene therapies come online, and like there are things where like with sickle cell, right? Like I
Yeah.
think there's gene therapy now where like you can like change the person's gene so that they don't have the negative effects of sickle cell. Um, for something like MAOA, like uh if someone's convicted of that, do you start to push for like just giving them the gene therapy to remove that gene from them to make them less aggressive? And two, bonus question, how much can you do that before you start running into Star Trek transporter problems?
I
Where
was
like
about
what
to
you're
say,
doing is essentially killing them and making a new person.
Okay. This is a great question. Thank you. There's so many fodders. There's so many intuition pumps in there. Okay, so the tower shooter. So Charles Whitman, he has a amygdala tumor. So there's writing that suggests he knew that something was wrong with him, and then he climbed up the UT tower. He shot several people. He ended up dead. And the state of Texas basically called for an autopsy and a medical report about him. And I find the language of it so interesting, because it's all language as if he was a natural disaster, like the catastrophe that happened. Like the report is written as if a hurricane has hit campus, rather than as a person who has committed a violent act. And I think what made that possible is because there's a very discrete cause, in this case, the tumor. And it's very easy to imagine the agent separate from that cause, because he had a whole life before this tumor. He was, in his late 20s, I believe, when this happened. And so the perspective on it was almost like this agent got eclipsed by this natural disaster, which is his amygdala tumor. And yes, he harmed people, but he had also been harmed. Like it was the tumor doing the shooting, almost, is how the language of it was. What's interesting when you move from the brain tumor to the genetic example is that even with a single gene, it becomes more difficult for people to imagine the agent as separate from the cause, because our genes are so wrapped up in our sense of who a person is. So if you're like, he didn't do it, his MAOA gene caused him to do it, but you think of the gene as very identified as constitutive of the person, then it's harder to kind of like it's harder for that like agent has been overcome by the cause kind of imagination to go away. And then when you move from the monogenic case to the polygenic case, what does it mean for some, if we're talking about 20% of your genome is involved in your risk for antisocial behavior or addiction because it's a massively polygenic trait, and all psychology is like that, what does it mean for them to have a different genome? And I think that's part of why genetic explanations for behavior are less reliably mitigating than environmental ones or even other biological ones like brain tumors. It's because when we can see a bigger separation between the agent and the cause, then they tend to be more mitigating. And as the cause and the agent become kind of collapsed in our imagination, those causes become less mitigating. Would I then say, okay, so we're not CRISPRing a massively polygenic trait. Like we're not going to go in and like fiddle with thousands of loci. But in the case of MAOA, like could they develop a gene therapy for it? I mean, I think that we would have the responsibility to the person for that. I mean, this is getting into another controversial area, which is like treating people for psychiatric behavioral problems beyond their will. But I think both for the sake of the person and for the sake of everyone else, if we had the ability to make someone not persistently impulsive and aggressive versus incarcerating them for the rest of their life, that seems like the less harmful option. Although I haven't thought about that particular scenario deeply. And the other thing is, I do think there is a Star Trek episode about this specifically. Like, is someone guilty after you've like reprogrammed? But I haven't watched it. My husband just told me this when I was writing the book. He was like, "Oh, this is all in Star Trek."
It seems
There
like
are
there's
both comments that say that's
yeah.
utopian and that's dystopian in the
Oh,
chat.
really?
So I think we're doing something right.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it well, is it more of a, is it, I mean, I think this is an interesting question. Is it more of a threat to a person's autonomy to CRISPR one gene than it is to incarcerate them or put them to death, which is what we currently do to people who commit? I mean, if
I
we're
guess
if we're if we're taking upon us that
to
the power of the
your
state has to kill you, then like perhaps it has the power to CRISPR one of your genes.
and to your point about choice that you made in the best baby post, like does the like you could say like, oh, we're not taking anything away from them by offering them the option of jail time or genetic like variation. But then does that like choice end up doing something bad in that then you have an option to not,
Yeah.
be executed or put in jail or whatever.
I mean, I think there's probably a large legal literature on this, which I'm not familiar with, because I'm pretty sure this is an option for sexual violence where offenders were given the
Yeah.
choice between chemical castration versus longer jail time. And
Yeah.
so I think that would probably be the like legal ethics analog that I would start if I was going to think through that more carefully.
Yeah. Thank you.
Definitely, like I'm sure that we'll start to see more and more of this kind of thing coming up. Both, the question of, like we said earlier, do you have a duty to choose the embryo that doesn't have the MOA mutation, ranging through, therapeutic approaches.
I mean, I think we're also having this debate right now around non-genetic therapies. There was a swing away from institutionalized care or mandating institutionalization for people who, for instance, have like very serious psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia. towards like they have the choice to not be treated. And now I think the pendulum is swinging back the other way, that it's not actually honoring that person's autonomy to not treat them if they are then living a life that's, you know, that's not good for them either. So I think that tension between what do you need in order to have autonomy, and is it always respecting autonomy to let them in a clearly disordered state say no? I think that's a complicated issue that society is sort of moving in different directions around right now.
Yeah. DJ, you're up.
Sorry, I keep asking too many questions, but I'm curious. This is sort of a detour, but you mentioned you were raised evangelical, and I'm wondering how that clash, or even maybe it wasn't a clash, but sort of going deeper into psychology as opposed to just kind of moral valence. I mean, is it kind of like Bart Ehrman, the more you learn, the less religious you are, or I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I write about this a lot in the book. I mean, we've talked about the science of the book, but the other half of the book is very much memoir, and it's the story of going from being a Christian teenager to a young scientist, and then now that I'm in middle age, thinking about that felt at the time like a big break. But actually there's there's kind of threads of continuity through there. And the one big thread of continuity is, I was raised evangelical, kind of in a Calvinist inflected school and religious environment. And Calvinism is has this idea that people are born bad. People are born, inherently depraved. And that's rooted in the same tradition as Augustine's doctrine of original sin. That's the title of my book, Original Sin, which is this idea that you physically inherit a predisposition towards moral violation. And that physical inheritance of it, the fact that humans are born with original sin, in Augustine's views, it didn't get you off the hook. It wasn't like, oh, you're born ineluctably, inevitably this way, and so therefore God has to forgive you. It was, you were born this way, and that makes you even more damnable. So, that's a Christian doctrine that's very much about, what did we inherit in our bodies? How does what we inherit in our bodies shape how we behave, and our felt sense that our behavior is not fully under our control, like whatever the I is in there. I can still quote a lot of scripture because I spent a lot of time in Bible school when I was growing up. And there's this line in Paul's letters to the Romans where he says, the things I want to do, I don't do. And the things I don't want to do, I keep on doing. And I don't think you have to be Christian to really know what he's talking about there. Like, we all had those experiences. And in that letter to the Romans, he really struggles with, if I inherited this, like, does that mean my creator is bad? If I inherited this, does that really mean I'm punishable for this? And I think that we still struggle with those exact same questions. We just do it in a scientific and secular register now rather than a Christian one. And all of the science is bringing continually into our consciousness. We inherit things in our bodies that shape how we behave, and that help structure this lived experience of, I do the things that I don't want to do, and the things I don't want to do, I keep doing them. And we're still trying to make sense of what that means for whether or not we're punishable. So I think I was interested in the same questions, and I just kind of jumped from arguing about them theologically to arguing about them in terms of science and the bioethics around the science. But I didn't realize, I did not have that awareness in my early 20s. It's something that I came to realize much later.
Interesting. Shine?
So in survey data, like what are people okay with changing? Like I'm talking about editing embryos or selecting among them, among different traits, like what are Americans okay with changing and like the rest of the world? Because when you said,
Yeah.
well, we want some place with no antisocial people, that sounds very American to me. Like I was thinking, what if you ask somebody in Finland or Japan? Maybe they're
Yeah,
for
that's
that.
so interesting. So, I mean, so one is like the current legal landscape on this varies widely between countries, right? So if you're doing IVF in France, you can select against trisomies, but you're legally barred from getting lots of other information. When my first book came out in its French translation, I had a bunch of interviews with French journalists, and the number of them who just voluntarily disclosed to me that, oh, well, so when we did IVF, we went to Switzerland. Or when we did IVF, we went to America, or to Israel, because I think they pay for it for up to 4 children. And so they would move to Israel for 6 months to get it paid for. And so there's this patchwork of legislation, and then there's also district hopping in order to, pick what's a friendly regime for your and then America is like the Wild West compared to the rest of the world, right? Like they're like, you have no rules about things. And then in terms of cross-cultural attitudes about this, it's, what are people's attitudes that aren't currently enshrined in law? I don't really know the answer to that. Michelle Meyer had this interesting paper with Pat Turley and a couple other people that was in Science that was asking about American attitudes towards embryo selection, specifically around is it acceptable for people to do IVF in order to increase their kids' chances of going to college by like 4% or something. And Americans were pretty much like, I mean, I do a lot to get my kid into college. That's like probably less like they were pretty okay with it in a way that I mean, I know Michelle in particular was surprised by it. So the other thing is that people were very opposed to IVF at first. And then now we think of it as a standard part of reproductive medicine, except if you're on, part of the religious right. And so people's attitudes about this, I think, are much more fluid than is commonly given credit for. You don't think so?
That's,
Nate's like, no, I don't know.
I would say specifically Catholics are against IVF because of the like conception, like
Yes.
soul enters at conception sort of thing. And like it's based on principles, I guess, of like where it is. And it didn't used to be the case that Protestants like were against IVF, and now they kind of are, and like they're adopting the other thing. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
anyway, that was
I mean,
that was
I
my
would say
objection.
generally Protestants on average are like much less consistent across attitudes and across time than Catholics are in a variety of reproductive attitudes. So, yeah.
On the topic of religion, I'm curious whether there are sort of this genetic basis for religiosity and like moralizing behavior as well.
Totally, there is.
And so, I feel like these things go together, right? The same that then you're going to have people who are going to be more judgmental of sort of these vices than and they're kind of being informed by their own genetic
Yes.
background,
So
right?
this was my dissertation. My dissertation was on genetic influences on religiosity. Um, and it was clearly me search. It was looking at, how did identical and fraternal twins converge and diverge in their religiousness as they were moving from adolescence into young adulthood. And it was very much a takeoff on work done by Lyndon Eves, who is now deceased, and was an interesting guy because he was both a behavior geneticist and an Anglican minister. And he maintained his belief in God and his belief in the church and his belief in the power of the genome until the end. He also would hold these meetings, and they were basically an effort to get young people who were really motivated to solve problems in the same room, and then he would give us problems that he was interested in. and he would promise you a nice bottle of wine if you could figure out the math of things. Which is a pretty good reward when you're like a very broke 24-year-old PhD student, is like a good bottle of wine. But anyways, he pioneered these amazing studies of identical twins reared apart, which you don't really get anymore because they don't separate twins at birth anymore. And I talk about one pair in my book where they both ended up very religious and not really believing any of this genetic nonsense, but talked about it in such strikingly similar terms that you could, you were kind of left to believe the way that they're seeing the world must be in part shaped by their genome, because how else would these two men sound so similar in their conceptions of God? And then Emily Willoughby, who's a grad student or I guess she's graduated now, but she was at the University of Minnesota. She did something on the heritability of beliefs and free will. And you see that too. So basically, I mean, religiousness, it wasn't Durkheim. It was, it'll come to me in a second. So someone has called it having a religiously musical mind. And it looks about as heritable as other attitudes and other personality traits. It's not, again, it's not genetic whether or not you're Christian versus Muslim versus, it's how much are you a joiner inner, and how much do you believe, really, like have a faith tradition. Seems to be, it's about as heritable as, as every other personality trait.
Interesting.
And punitiveness too. So you don't have to be religious to be punitive, but the kind of attitudes of, I believe in corporal punishment, or I believe in the death penalty, or just the extent to which you express support for sorts of harsh retribution for violations of perceived moral or social norms. That's also a pretty heritable attitude.
Interesting.
There's no escaping the body, even when you're thinking about spirituality and punishment, which we think of as escaping the body.
Cannot be done.
Mm-mm.
Done. Okay. I'm gonna go in like one last little direction that I kind of have been thinking about personally. So I've got like a couple sentences from an article that you wrote back in 2021 that I included as one of the readings, which I think is probably drawing more on material from your previous book. But you wrote, the fundamental problem with hereditarianism isn't that genetics matters for human difference. The fundamental problem with hereditarianism is the idea that society should be structured as a race we all compete in, rather than a building we all have to live in. And I feel like this reveals this sort of tension between like the scales of the individual and society. And I think that when we think of these kind of like antisocial behaviors, like that's one of the places where that tension really becomes important, because like thinking about how we respond to someone who commits a crime because of the way that they're kind of genetically predisposed, there is a real sense in which, a mindset that says, well, for the good of society, we have to kind of put this person, we have to protect society from them doing it again, right, becomes quite quite important. And I think you mentioned earlier this sort of this tension around this sort of pendulum almost within the US of institutionalization for mental health, and it's sort of like the society that is more individualistic would say, well, it's like an individual's right to kind of like live out their destiny or whatever it is, because if we can stop someone from living freely on the street, we can also stop someone from like achieving their dreams. Whereas if you have a kind of more collective society scale view, you might say, okay, well, this choice is leading to harm for themselves and the people around them. And so, the better solution for everybody would be to put them get them some help, despite their will. So, I'm curious how you think of this sort of transition between scales of like how this plays out at the societal level versus the individual level.
Yeah. Okay. So
Big question.
again, as a preface, I don't think I have the answer to this. But here are some reactions, I guess, or responses to that. So that the difference between those two metaphors from that older piece, a race that we compete in versus a house that we all have to live in together. When we're thinking about this, not in terms of intelligence or education or distributive justice, when we're thinking instead about genetics in relation to retributive justice, I do still think that we can think about, are we focusing on trying to figure out what everyone deserves, which is a very individually focused question? Or are we trying to figure out how to make this place a place that we all want to live in? And so often genetics gets brought in as if it can only bear on the question of, can we figure out how much people deserve? And maybe if it's genetic, they deserve to suffer more, to be punished more. Maybe if it's genetic, they deserve to suffer less because they couldn't have done it that way. And then there are people who argue, I mean, I think this would be like the Robert Sapolsky argument that like, if it's not genetic, it's environmental. If it's not environmental, it's luck. And that just makes the whole concept of punishment and moral responsibility obsolete. I tend to disagree with that. And part of that is because if you look at any cooperative system, whether we're talking about human societies or we're talking about animal societies or we're talking about colonies of bacteria or we're talking about symbiotic organism like figs and wasps, all cooperative systems have some mechanism of enforcing violations of cooperation, and there's no getting around that. So I think for me, that has shifted the question from how can we use genetics to better figure out who deserves to be punished, how much, to thinking about, if we were keeping in mind all cooperative systems need enforcement, and we're keeping in mind all people are profoundly shaped by luck, including genetic luck that they didn't choose. How then do we want to design a system to keep each other accountable that doesn't devolve into this like punishment fest that in my opinion America is now? So that's kind of the shift from the more individualistic view to the social view that I think you're getting at. And then related to that question is, in the focus on the individual, I think American society is very focused on freedom from interference. I want to be able to run my race without anyone handicapping me. I want to be able to live my whereas I think we can also think about freedom too. Like what affordances, what opportunities, what positive freedoms are we giving people? The freedom to be educated rather than the freedom from, and in that way, going back to the CRISPR example, which I think is a brilliant question for us to think about, is what is actually increasing a person's freedom more in that situation? And it might be increasing their freedom more and other people's freedom more if there's an intervention that's biological, but that changes this chronic predisposition to violence. I think that's a sticky wicket, and that's going to be a controversial thing. But that question of how do we, going back to that metaphor, a house we want to live in, you have the most freedom in a house and you have the most enjoyment also when other people are nice and they're playing by the rules. So you get giving up a little bit of your freedom to do whatever you want can actually give you freedom to enjoy a lot more in that situation. So I don't know if that's not an answer, but that's a response.
Seems like it's a pretty good answer to me. John, I'd love to hear from you.
Hi, Paige, I love the genetic lottery. I learned so much reading it, and I read it twice, which I rarely do for book.
Oh, what a compliment. As an author on Pub Week, where you just feel like you're screaming into the void, I thank you so much for telling me that. I really, really appreciate it.
So to follow, I assume I'll enjoy this next one as much, but I wanted to ask why did you write this new book? And I'm sorry if that was in the read ahead, which I just
Yeah,
now found.
no, so it's so funny. I originally planned this whole thing as I thought I would write 2 papers because I got a little grant from the Templeton Foundation. Your Southern accent is going to make mine come out. Where the grant was on the implications of genetics for distributive and retributive justice. And it was a grant with a philosopher. And so we were going to write 1 paper on distributive justice and 1 paper on retributive justice. And then that first paper on distributive justice just kept growing and growing. And then I thought, well, it'll be a series of papers. And then someone approached me and said, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I was like, no, I'm not in a book discipline, but that sounds awesome. So that came that. But then I'd always had this, like, there's another half of my research program, which is on antisocial behavior and addiction. And I'd always thought of this as kind of the evil twin of the first paper, right? Like, how does this play on our, there's the praise and there's the reward, but then there's also the blame and the punishment. The book is, when you read it, you'll see it's really different in voice than the first one. And there's a lot more memoir in it and a lot more personal content. And that was because, one, I wanted to try something new. And 2, there's, the question is, the topic is really about this tension between the scientific perspective on behavior and how that can sometimes feel in tension with the lived experience of being a person who feels like they're choosing, like the subjective sense of, like, and I'm going through the world and I feel guilt and I feel shame and I hold other people responsible and I resent them and I blame them and I think of myself as an agent and I study people as if they're animals with genes. And there's lots of books on that tension. Sam Harris has written on that, and Dawkins has written on that, and Dennett has written on that. But so little of the tension is actually on the page. So you get a lot about, this conflict between different ways of viewing people, but you don't get a whole lot of what it's like to be Daniel Dennett in his books, right? What is it like for him? How does this tension play out in his actual life? And I didn't want to write a book about the tension between the subjective and the objective. I wanted a book that had that tension represented in the content and that was on the page. So if you read it and you're like, this is wow, that's quite the opener, that's why. That's the tension I'm going for there.
Great. I can't wait to read it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Nate, what does your comment mean in the chat?
Horsemen?
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
left out Christopher.
Yeah.
The 4 horsemen of new atheism were Dennett, Harris, Dawkins, and Hitchens. And so her 3 examples were 3 of those 4 horsemen.
But they do. I mean, Dawkins is a geneticist and Harris is a neuroscientist and Dennett.
That's true. That's
true. Yeah, right. Yeah. And so, I think, I don't think their atheism is an accident relative to their preoccupation with people. People are embodied. People are biological creatures with genes and brains. So yeah.
I take that as from someone who agrees with their conclusions, I guess.
Yeah. Shine.
So I've read your book and blog, but I've also read Turkheimer and Gusev and Fluhman and all of them. So when you say from the scientific point of view, it seems to me there's a lot of disagreement.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what.
Although there's a lot more about education and IQ than there is about, just scientifically than there is about addiction per se.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in your new book, which so is it like a memoir slash philosophy book? Is it
Yeah, I guess it would be a science, it would be science, it would be hybrid science nonfiction memoir with a lot of philosophy.
okay.
Yeah.
And is it sort of does it survey all the attitudes, or do you take a particular stance on how heritable something is?
No, it doesn't survey all so it does not get into like what does heritability mean? Why do people disagree with heritability estimates? I mean, partly because like that's been done to death. Like
Mhm.
I didn't feel like I had anything new to say or any new way to say it in a new book. Um, and so and also, it's not Princeton, it's Random House. It's written for, a purely trade audience. My editor is not a scientist. Her other book that she launched this month is Discipline, which is a novel by Larissa Pham. And so it was really interesting to me how much she was like, yeah, you're way too in the weeds of the scientific debate here. Like there's a lot of footnotes and there's a lot of like references to the literature. Um, but I'm really taking out the starting point as a starting point, and that like I am confident in my judgments that
Mm.
addiction and antisocial behavior are heritable, that heritability is not an artifact. And uh, the genetic estimates that we're getting from measured genotypes are much less confounded by population stratification and environmental structure than you would see for something like IQ or
Mm.
education. So, if you're reading Gustav, like if you want to dive in, like our newest preprint, we have a whole series of like within family analyses, and it's basically like it is less entwined with social status across generations than IQ, which makes it scientifically a little bit easier. So, I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure people will still quibble with it, but they'll, that's the nature of behavior genetics.
Oh no, I'm actually glad because I am kind of burned out by that debate.
I'm
I'm a
kind of burned out
physicist,
about it too. Yeah. I mean,
so
yeah.
I'm just an outsider who's curious and can do math. Then it's just it gets tedious after a while. So I'm glad this is a little bit different.
Yes. No, there's no debates about what heritability means in there. So.
All right. Thank you.
You're hoping your readers have kind of got that part covered
Also,
elsewhere.
I feel like, I mean, some part of it is, and I think this is true, you can't make art in a defensive crouch. As long as you're thinking about here are all the potential counter arguments that could ever occur to someone on the internet, and then how do I anticipate them? There is a role for that, um, and that is like a dominant mode of reasoning and like a philosophical scholarly piece, right? Of like, here's 17 counter arguments and then my responses to them and the potential responses to them. But that makes for a really boring, book for the general reader. And so I was thinking about this as like, if you are not a scientist, but you're a mom or you're a child and you're thinking about, why are my kids like this? Why am I like this? Why am I different from my parents? Why am I similar to my parents? Um, how much should I forgive myself for these things that I've been dragging around with me my whole life? What of the science would you be interested in? And if it didn't make that cut, it didn't make it into the book.
Hmm. I feel like that's a really like beautiful way to kind of end our
Okay.
salon and to kind of come to those thoughts and like have those be the kind of things that we take with us.
All right. Well, this has been an absolute delight. I did not know what to expect, and I would recommend this to any author. I think I mean, I think reminding yourself that there are smart, curious people in the world with such great questions who read books and want to think about them is such a delight. So I really appreciate you spending your evening with me. This was really fun.
Thank you for doing it.
Yeah, thank you. This is a
Thank
real
you.
treat.
Thank you. Thank you for just like sharing so much, both about, your book, but the thing I love about these kinds of events is how much they expand beyond what it's a book talk, but it's not only about the book, right?
Yeah.
It's also about everything that kind of led to it and other, next directions, what happens, what if we can now CRISPR out,
I'm totally going to use that with my undergrads. Thank you for giving me that what if.
But yeah, thank you so much, and thank you so much everybody for coming. It's been wonderful as always. And hopefully I'll see you all at the next one.
All right. And congratulations on your pregnancy. That's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Best of luck to you.
Thank you so much.
All right.